Hey guys, tonight we're talking about ancient Egypt, a civilization of pyramids, gods, sacred order, and men who were given absolute power and absolutely no adult supervision. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Akhenaten didn't just rule Egypt, he emotionally confused it. Publicly, permanently, in stone, for eternity. If ancient Egypt had a concept of oversharing, Akhenaten would have been their founding influencer. Before him, pharaohs were portrayed as distant, stiff, and godlike. They stared forward. They never smiled. They didn't cuddle. They didn't touch. They didn't show affection. They existed like divine statues that occasionally moved for ceremonies. Family life happened quietly behind palace walls, where it belonged, far away from the public and definitely far away from temple carvings. Akhenaten saw all of that and said, no. Instead, he commissioned art of himself lounging with his wife Nefertiti, touching her face, sitting knee to knee, holding hands, kissing their daughters, and generally behaving like a man who thought emotional intimacy was a public performance. These scenes weren't small, they weren't subtle. They were carved into temples, massive reliefs, public monuments, stone billboards of family bonding. Now, yes, Egyptian symbolism, divine breath, religious metaphors, Aten theology, spiritual unity, etc. Historians can explain it all very calmly. But ancient Egyptians didn't read academic footnotes. They saw their god-king acting like a dad at a family picnic and collectively thought, this feels new. And then there was Akhenaten's appearance. He was depicted with elongated limbs, wide hips, soft curves, narrow shoulders, and an almost androgynous body shape. A visual style so different from the muscular warrior kings before him that it looked like Egypt had accidentally hired a completely different species of ruler. Where earlier pharaohs looked like gym statues, Akhenaten looked like a philosophical art project. Some scholars say it was symbolic, some say medical, some say religious. Ancient Egyptians just knew one thing. This man does not look like the other gods. So rumours started. Whispers, side eyes, quiet temple gossip. When you change religion, art, gender imagery, royal behaviour, and public intimacy all at once, people don't calmly adjust. They panic politely. To modern eyes, Akhenaten looks almost progressive. Open affection, emotional vulnerability, family focus. But to his own society, he felt unsettling. Pharaohs weren't supposed to be relatable. They weren't supposed to be tender. They weren't supposed to make people wonder what exactly was happening behind palace doors. Akhenaten didn't just change religion, he changed boundaries. And Egypt absolutely hated the update. If Akhenaten made Egypt uncomfortable by breaking boundaries, Ramses II made Egypt tired by never stopping. This man did everything in bulk: temples, statues, inscriptions, wars, and yes, children, especially children. Ramses ruled for so long that most Egyptians only ever knew one king, which already creates a dangerous situation psychologically. But Ramses didn't just rule. He reproduced with the enthusiasm of a man who believed fertility was a divine obligation and subtlety was a personal insult. By conservative estimates, Ramses fathered over 100 children. Let that sink in. That's not a family tree. That's an administrative nightmare. Entire palace wings were dedicated just to housing his offspring, and historians still argue over how many there actually were, because at some point people stopped counting out of self-preservation. Royal marriages in Egypt were political, yes, but Ramses treated marriage like a hobby. He married Egyptian noblewomen, foreign princesses, secondary wives, and concubines, stacking alliances and heirs with the same energy modern people collect streaming subscriptions. Did he need all of them? No. Did he want all of them? Absolutely. What makes Ramses especially fascinating is that he wanted you to know. His inscriptions bragged about his virility the way other kings bragged about military victories. He wasn't content being remembered as strong or victorious. He wanted future generations to understand that he was also extremely busy and private. Reliefs show him surrounded by wives and children, presented as proof of divine favour. In Ramses' worldview, producing endless heirs wasn't indulgence, it was cosmic balance. The gods clearly approved because look at all these babies. Checkmate. And Egypt largely went along with it. Ramses won wars, stabilised borders, and built monuments that still dominate the landscape today. When a king delivers peace and prosperity, society becomes remarkably tolerant of excess. If anything, his fertility was seen as reassuring. A stable dynasty needs heirs. Ramses had backups for his backups. But from a modern perspective, it's hard not to notice how unchecked power manifests. Ramses never faced limits. No one said enough. No one suggested rest. No one dared imply moderation. When you are worshipped as a living god, self-control becomes optional. Ramses didn't scandalize Egypt with secrecy. He overwhelmed it with volume. And if history teaches us anything, it's this. When power lasts long enough, excess stops feeling excessive and starts feeling normal. Pepi II didn't become scandalous by being flashy. He became scandalous by ruling for so long that everyone eventually got bored. And bored courts invent stories. Lots of stories. The kind that stick around for centuries because no one is alive anymore to deny them. Pepi ascended the throne as a child and then simply never left. He ruled for decades upon decades, long enough to outlive rivals, heirs, advisors, and probably several generations of palace gossip. When a king stays in power that long, two things happen. First, institutions decay. Second, rumours get wild. Later Egyptian texts, written generations after Pepi's death, claimed that the aging pharaoh had a habit of sneaking out of the palace at night to visit the wife of a trusted general. Not publicly, not ceremonially, secretly, disguised. Like a man who knew very well that even gods aren't immune to scandal if enough people notice. Was it true? No one knows. Contemporary records are silent, which is suspicious in itself. Egyptian scribes were very good at recording victories and very bad at recording embarrassment. But the fact that the rumour survived tells us something important. People found it believable, and that's the key. Pepi ruled during the slow collapse of the Old Kingdom. Central authority weakened. Officials grew independent. The once divine image of the pharaoh cracked. When the state falters, respect erodes. And when respect erodes, whispers grow louder. By the time later writers described Pepi's alleged nocturnal adventures, the story served a purpose. It explained decline. It personalized decay. Instead of abstract economic problems, you had an aging ruler slipping through the streets at night, indulging in private desires while the kingdom quietly unravelled. It's not even the affair itself that matters here. It's the symbolism. Pepi became a cautionary tale, a reminder that when power lingers too long, discipline fades. When no one can remove you, no one can stop you. And when no one can stop you, the rules start to feel optional. To modern eyes, Pepi looks less like a villain and more like a tragic figure, a child king who outlived the system that made him sacred. But ancient audiences didn't need nuance. They needed a story, and Pepi's story became one of secrecy, indulgence, and a ruler who stayed too long. Pepi II didn't scandalize Egypt in his youth. He became scandalous by outlasting accountability, and history never forgives that. Cleopatra VII is a fascinating case, because her scandal wasn't created by what she did. It was created by who wrote about her afterward. If ancient history had a comment section, Cleopatra would have been ratioed into oblivion by Roman authors with severe confidence issues. To be clear, Cleopatra ruled Egypt intelligently, spoke multiple languages, stabilized a collapsing kingdom, and negotiated directly with the most powerful men in the Mediterranean. Naturally, Roman historians looked at this and thought, obviously, she must be dangerously seductive, because heaven forbid a woman be competent without some kind of moral explanation. Most of what we know about Cleopatra's supposed excess comes from Roman writers who despised her. These were men who lived in a society deeply uncomfortable with women wielding political power. When Cleopatra aligned herself with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony, Roman propaganda didn't describe this as diplomacy. It described it as enchantment, magic, corruption, the ancient equivalent of saying he only lost because she distracted him. Cleopatra's entrances were theatrical. She understood symbolism. She used luxury, spectacle, and intimacy as political tools. Not because she was indulgent, but because politics in the ancient world was theatre. When she arrived rolled in a carpet or hosted lavish banquets, she wasn't being excessive. She was negotiating in a language Rome understood very well when it benefited them. But once Rome won, the narrative flipped. Suddenly, Cleopatra wasn't a ruler. She was a temptress. Her intelligence became manipulation. Her alliances became indulgence. Her confidence became danger. Roman poets painted her as a decadent Eastern queen who weakened strong Roman men with luxury and pleasure, which is a very convenient story when you want to blame a civil war on someone who isn't Roman. What makes Cleopatra's case especially ironic is that Roman elites were wildly indulgent themselves. Their banquets, affairs, and power games would make most pharaohs look restrained. But Rome didn't mind excess. It minded who controlled it. So Cleopatra became history's favourite villainous woman, not because she broke taboos, but because she refused to submit quietly. Her perversion was independence. Her crime was competence without permission. Cleopatra didn't scandalize Egypt. She terrified Rome. And history, written by the victors, turned fear into scandal. Tutankhamun is often remembered as the polite, golden-faced boy king who didn't really have time to do anything scandalous before dying young. Which is true, but also misleading. Because Tutankhamun didn't need to do anything perverted. He was born directly into it. Ancient Egyptian royalty believed their bloodline was divine. The gods married their siblings, therefore kings did too. Simple logic. Questionable execution. This meant incest wasn't a scandal. It was state policy. What modern society considers deeply disturbing, ancient Egypt framed as sacred tradition wrapped in ritual and gold leaf. Tutankhamun was the product of this system. Genetic evidence shows he was born from closely related parents, likely siblings. To Egyptians at the time, this preserved divine purity. To modern observers, it explains a long list of medical problems and makes everyone quietly uncomfortable. And it didn't stop with his birth. Tutankhamun himself married a close family member, continuing the cycle without hesitation. There was no debate, no moral struggle, no dramatic palace meeting where someone suggested maybe expanding the gene pool just a little. The system was bigger than the individual. You didn't opt out. You complied. What makes this especially unsettling is how normalized it was. This wasn't hidden. It wasn't whispered about in corners. It was carved into stone and blessed by priests. When the entire religious system says something is holy, it stops being taboo, no matter how strange it looks centuries later. Of course, there were consequences. Tutankhamun suffered from multiple health issues, struggled physically, and required medical support just to function normally. Ancient artists tried to hide this behind idealized imagery, but reality leaked through. Divine blood came with very human costs. To be fair, Tutankhamun himself didn't invent this tradition. He inherited it. He was a teenager following rules written long before he was born, rules that valued symbolic purity over actual well-being. In that sense, he's less a villain and more a cautionary example of what happens when tradition becomes untouchable. Tutankhamun wasn't perverted in the indulgent sense. He was perverted by system design. When power declares something sacred, it doesn't matter how strange it is. It becomes normal. And everyone pretends not to notice the consequences. If Tutankhamun shows us what happens when tradition runs on autopilot, Amenhotep III shows us what happens when everything is going too well for too long. His reign was one of peace, wealth, and international prestige, which, historically speaking, is when rulers start confusing stability with personal entitlement. Amenhotep didn't conquer relentlessly. He didn't panic about enemies. He inherited a strong state and decided to enjoy it, thoroughly. His Egypt was rich, admired, and drowning in gold. Foreign rulers sent him gifts, daughters, and flattering letters that basically said, "Please like us." And Amenhotep accepted all of it with the enthusiasm of a man who believed the universe was his reward program. His palace life became legendary. Banquets were frequent. Festivals were extravagant. The court overflowed with musicians, dancers, entertainers, and foreign princesses sent as diplomatic gifts. Officially, these marriages secured alliances. Unofficially, Amenhotep collected wives the way people collect souvenirs. Proof he had been somewhere important. At some point, diplomacy turned into indulgence. Amenhotep's harem grew massive, and his inscriptions never missed a chance to remind everyone how favoured he was by the gods. If Akhenaten overshared emotionally, Amenhotep overshared materially. Everything was bigger, shinier, louder, and more expensive, including his personal life. What makes this interesting is that no one objected. Why would they? Egypt was peaceful, trade flowed, temples rose. When a ruler delivers prosperity, society becomes incredibly flexible about what counts as excess. Is the king indulging? Turns into, well, he earned it. But indulgence has side effects. Amenhotep grew increasingly detached from administration, delegating more responsibility while focusing on pleasure and spectacle. By the end of his reign, he ruled more like a divine celebrity than an active governor. The court revolved around ritual, luxury, and appearance, not restraint. This atmosphere shaped the next generation. Akhenaten didn't emerge from nowhere. He was raised in a world where excess was normal, indulgence was divine, and limits were optional. Amenhotep didn't break Egypt, but he softened it. He turned power into comfort, and comfort into expectation. Amenhotep III wasn't perverted in a scandalous way. He was perverted by success without consequence, and history is very clear on this point. When rulers stop worrying about survival, they start indulging in themselves. Hatshepsut didn't scandalize Egypt by indulging too much. She scandalized Egypt by being there at all, which, historically speaking, is often enough. Ancient Egypt had queens, priestesses, royal wives, and powerful women behind the scenes. But the throne itself was supposed to be male. Not metaphorically. Literally. Kingship was wrapped in masculine symbolism, ritual language, and divine imagery so rigid that trying to bend it caused a collective cultural headache. So when Hatshepsut stepped forward and declared herself pharaoh, Egypt didn't know what to do with its face. She didn't rule as queen regent, quietly guiding a young heir. She ruled openly, publicly, confidently. She wore the crown, the royal kilt, and yes, the ceremonial false beard. Not because she wanted to confuse anyone, but because the job description required it. If kingship came with a beard, then fine. She'd take the beard. To conservative elites, this wasn't just political disruption, it was cosmic discomfort. The pharaoh wasn't just a ruler. The pharaoh was the bridge between gods and earth. If the bridge suddenly changed shape, people worried the universe might notice. And so rumours began. Not about her competence, she was extremely competent, but about her body, her sexuality, her legitimacy. When a woman breaks power structures, scandal rushes in to fill the silence. It always does. Accusations don't need evidence, they just need anxiety. Hatshepsut responded the most threatening way possible, by governing well. Her reign was stable, trade expanded, temples rose, art flourished, no disasters, no collapse, which only made things worse for her critics, because now they couldn't say, "This is wrong because it fails." They had to say, "This is wrong because it shouldn't exist." Later rulers attempted to erase her memory, not because she was immoral, but because she proved something dangerous, that the system could bend and survive. And nothing frightens tradition more than flexibility. Hatshepsut wasn't indulgent. She wasn't excessive. She wasn't perverted in any personal sense. Her scandal was structural. She exposed how fragile power narratives really are, and how quickly society will invent moral panic when someone doesn't fit the mould. And in the long list of pharaohs who abused their privilege, Hatshepsut's greatest crime was simply refusing to stay in her assigned box. Thutmose III is often remembered as Egypt's greatest military commander, efficient, disciplined, relentlessly successful. which is exactly why his private life feels oddly missing. When a man leaves behind dozens of inscriptions about battles, victories, and divine favour, but almost nothing about personal relationships, historians start squinting at the records and saying, all right, what's being left out? Because silence, in ancient history, is rarely accidental. Unlike other pharaohs who proudly displayed wives, children, and domestic scenes, Thutmose kept his personal life firmly off the public stage. No affectionate reliefs, no celebratory family monuments, no enthusiastic inscriptions about royal fertility or divine unions. Just conquest, conquest, conquest. And then more conquest. Now, this could mean Thutmose was deeply private, entirely possible. It could also mean scribes were instructed to keep certain things off the record, also possible. Ancient Egyptian records were not neutral diaries. They were curated propaganda, and what didn't serve the image often disappeared quietly. Adding to the intrigue is Thutmose's relationship with his stepmother and predecessor, Hatshepsut. After her death, her images were systematically removed, her names erased, her monuments altered. This wasn't a spontaneous tantrum, it was a calculated effort to rewrite memory. And when a ruler is willing to erase someone so thoroughly, historians wonder what else he was willing to erase. Was this about legitimacy? Likely. Was it about resentment? Possibly. Was it about controlling the narrative of kingship? Almost certainly. Thutmose's reign reinforced a hyper-masculine image of the pharaoh. Warrior, conqueror, unstoppable force. Anything that complicated that image, emotional bonds, unconventional relationships, domestic vulnerability, simply didn't make the cut. If it didn't fit the brand, it vanished. And here's the thing. Extreme control over public image often signals anxiety beneath the surface. When power is secure, rulers can afford openness. When it feels threatened, silence becomes policy. Thutmose III didn't scandalize Egypt with indulgence. He scandalized historians with absence. His perversion, if we're using the term loosely, wasn't excess. It was erasure. A reminder that power doesn't just express itself through indulgence. Sometimes it hides. Sometimes it deletes. Sometimes it leaves behind a spotless image so clean it feels artificial. And in ancient history, the cleanest images often hide the messiest truths. Seti I rarely shows up on lists of scandalous rulers, which is exactly why he belongs here. He represents a quieter kind of excess. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't shock, and never gets caught on temple walls doing anything awkward. Instead, it operates smoothly, politely, and entirely out of reach for everyone else. Seti ruled with confidence and competence. He restored order after instability, repaired temples, and presented himself as the calm adult in the room. And like many calm adults with absolute power, he enjoyed the benefits quietly while maintaining a spotless public image. Think less public scandal, more private comfort with no questions asked. Royal privilege in Seti's time meant access. Access to people, to bodies, to privacy, and to silence. The palace was a sealed world where consent was assumed, hierarchy was law, and no was a word reserved for peasants speaking upward, not for kings receiving downward. We don't have explicit records of Seti's private indulgences, and that's the point. Egyptian court culture excelled at discretion. Wives and concubines existed as a structural feature of kingship, not as a moral issue. When indulgence is institutionalized, it stops generating scandal and starts generating paperwork. Seti's reputation as a good king also worked in his favor. Successful rulers get privacy. They get benefit of the doubt. They get historians saying things like, "There's no evidence of excess," which in ancient terms often means no one was allowed to write it down. His court set the tone for his son, Ramses II, a tone that normalized abundance, normalized access, and normalized the idea that a pharaoh's desires were simply part of cosmic order. Seti didn't invent the system, but he ran it smoothly enough that no one thought to question it. And that's where the subtle perversion lies, not in outrageous behavior, not in scandalous rumors, but in a structure where privilege is invisible because it's expected. Seti I didn't need to break rules. The rules were written for him. When power is polite, it's harder to criticize. When indulgence wears a calm smile and a well-maintained temple facade, it blends into history unnoticed, leaving behind a legacy that looks clean, orderly, and deeply unequal. And sometimes that's the most dangerous kind of excess of all. Khufu didn't need scandals. He had gravity, the kind that bends everything around it. When you build the Great Pyramid, people stop asking questions, mostly because they're too busy hauling limestone and reconsidering their life choices. Khufu ruled during a time when the pharaoh wasn't just divine, he was untouchable, not metaphorically, literally. The king was the state, the god's representative, and the owner of basically everything, including your labor, your time, and your opinion. If Khufu wanted something, the universe politely rearranged itself to make that happen. Later, Greek writers painted Khufu as cruel, cold, and morally indifferent. They claimed he closed temples, ignored religious customs, and ruled with a heavy hand. Now, to be fair, these accounts were written long after his death and absolutely drip with Greek bias. But they tell us something important. Khufu's reputation curdled over time. People remembered him not as a benevolent god-king, but as a man who treated humans like building materials. And here's where the perversion comes in, not sexual, but psychological. When no one can say no to you, boundaries dissolve. Privacy becomes infinite. Desire becomes policy. Khufu didn't need to flaunt indulgence, because indulgence was assumed. The palace was a closed system where hierarchy replaced consent and silence replaced accountability. Did Khufu abuse this power personally? We don't have inscriptions saying Khufu behaved badly today, because that's not how Egyptian records worked. But when a ruler commands tens of thousands of people to work for decades on a tomb meant only for himself, historians raise an eyebrow. That level of self-focus isn't neutral, it's revealing. Khufu's pyramid wasn't just a tomb, it was a declaration. I matter more than all of you, forever. And when a society builds that declaration stone by stone, it sends a clear message about whose desires come first. Unlike later pharaohs who indulged publicly or privately, Khufu embodied a colder form of excess. His perversion wasn't pleasure, it was scale. A system where human lives were abstract units, and the king's will was the only constant. Khufu didn't shock Egypt with scandal. He normalized domination. And when domination becomes normal, history stops recording abuse, because it stops recognizing it as something unusual. If Khufu represents absolute power without feedback, Senusret III represents something even more unsettling: absolute power with a clipboard. This was a man who didn't just rule Egypt, he managed it. Intensely, relentlessly, with the emotional warmth of a locked door. Senusret was a brilliant military leader and administrator. He fortified borders, crushed rebellions, reorganized provinces, and weakened local elites so thoroughly that no one could challenge him. Egypt became safer, more centralized, and significantly more anxious. Think well-run state, crossed with everyone whispering indoors. What makes Senusret fascinating isn't indulgence, it's obsession. He didn't flaunt excess. He eliminated alternatives. Regional governors lost autonomy. Local power networks were dismantled. The state became a direct extension of the pharaoh's will. If you were wondering who was in charge, the answer was always the same, carved in stone with intimidating cheekbones, and those statues matter. Senusret's official portraits show a king with deep-set eyes, heavy lids, and an expression that says, "I am tired of your nonsense, and I haven't even heard it yet." Gone was the youthful idealism of earlier rulers. This was authority with bags under its eyes. Here's where the perversion angle quietly enters. Extreme control creates extreme privacy. When surveillance tightens everywhere else, the palace becomes the only unregulated space. The king who controls everything outside controls everything inside too. Bodies, schedules, access, silence. No one records what happens behind closed doors because everyone understands who owns the doors. Senusret didn't need a harem to signal power. The system itself did that for him. When hierarchy is absolute, consent becomes theoretical. The king's desires don't clash with law, they are the law. What's especially telling is that later rulers backed away from his level of centralization. It worked too well. It concentrated too much fear, too much pressure, too much dependence on a single figure. Egypt survived Senusret, but it exhaled afterward. Senusret III wasn't scandalous in the loud sense. He didn't chase excess. He perfected dominance. And history reminds us that when control becomes total, indulgence doesn't need to be recorded, because no one is left who can question it. If earlier pharaohs made people uncomfortable quietly, Ptolemy II did it formally, publicly, with paperwork. He didn't just participate in taboo behaviour. He legalised it, celebrated it, and then put it on coins. Ptolemy ruled Egypt during the Greek Ptolemaic period, which already made things culturally awkward. Greek elites had moved into Egypt, adopted Egyptian kingship, and then immediately discovered they were expected to behave like gods. This included one very specific divine tradition: sibling marriage. So Ptolemy married his sister, not secretly, not reluctantly, openly, proudly, with full religious ceremony. He even earned the nickname Philadelphus, meaning sibling lover, which is the kind of title that sounds better in ancient Greek than it does out loud in modern conversation. To Egyptians, this wasn't shocking. Pharaohs had married siblings before to preserve divine bloodlines. Gods married gods. Kings did the same. Very neat, very mythological. But to Greek observers, who were very much not raised on this tradition, it was deeply unsettling. Greek writers twisted themselves into philosophical knots, trying to explain how this could possibly be acceptable. Ptolemy, meanwhile, did not care. In fact, he leaned into it. He and his sister-wife were presented as a divine couple, modelled after sibling gods. Temples honoured them together. Coins displayed their paired images. If anyone had objections, they were welcome to keep them extremely private. This is where power reshapes morality. When a ruler is worshipped as divine, taboo doesn't disappear. It flips. What would horrify normal people becomes sacred when performed by the king. The act doesn't change. The framing does. And once something is framed as holy, criticism becomes heresy. Ptolemy II didn't invent sibling marriage, but he perfected its public branding. He normalised it so thoroughly that future Ptolemaic rulers followed suit, turning what began as tradition into dynastic habit, with predictable consequences for health, stability, and reputation. Ptolemy wasn't perverted in the chaotic sense. He was methodical. He shows us something crucial about absolute power. It doesn't just break rules, it relabels them. And once the label changes, society adjusts, even if it has to stop making eye contact with the family tree. If Ptolemy II shows us how taboo can be normalised through ceremony, Ptolemy IV shows us what happens when the ruler stops pretending to care about literally anything else. This was not a man interested in governance, discipline, or long-term stability. This was a man interested in being comfortable, entertained, and left alone. Ancient sources describe Ptolemy IV as a ruler who outsourced the boring parts of kingship so he could focus on pleasure. Administration? Delegated. Military matters? Delegated. Public appearances? Only if absolutely necessary, and preferably followed by a banquet. The state ran on inertia, while the king ran on indulgence. What makes Ptolemy IV particularly unsettling is how openly this happened. There was no attempt to hide it behind divine symbolism or religious duty. He didn't pretend his excess served the gods or the people. He simply enjoyed the privileges of absolute power and let everyone else deal with the consequences. The royal court became a playground. Entertainers, favourites, and courtiers competed for influence not through competence, but through proximity. If you wanted power, you didn't govern well, you pleased the king. And pleasing the king often meant encouraging the very behaviours that were hollowing out the state. Ancient historians accuse him of surrounding himself with corrupt advisors and indulging in constant luxury while Egypt's institutions weakened. Now, as always, we should read hostile sources carefully. But even allowing for exaggeration, a pattern emerges. When leadership becomes optional, decadence fills the vacuum. The irony is that Ptolemy IV still ruled a powerful kingdom. Egypt's wealth masked dysfunction. As long as grain shipments flowed and rituals continued, the illusion of stability held. But beneath the surface, neglect spread quietly, the most dangerous kind of decay. This is indulgence not as scandal, but as abandonment. A ruler so insulated by power that consequences feel theoretical. Ptolemy didn't shock people with outrageous acts. He disappointed them with absence. Ptolemy IV wasn't perverted because he crossed taboos. He was perverted because he stopped caring. And history is unforgiving to rulers who treat power like a luxury item. When indulgence replaces responsibility, decline doesn't arrive with drama. It arrives slowly, politely, and then all at once. Nero was not an Egyptian pharaoh. He did not wear the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. He did not build pyramids, and he did not pretend to be Horus in human form. And yet, in Egypt, he might as well have been one. Under Roman rule, emperors were worshipped in Egypt as divine figures. This meant that Nero, a man already famous for excess, ego, and questionable decision-making, suddenly found himself receiving religious reverence in a culture that treated rulers as gods by default. This was not a healthy combination. Egyptian temples honoured Nero with statues and inscriptions. Priests performed rituals in his name. Offerings were made. To Egyptians, this was business as usual. To Nero, this was validation on an almost dangerous level. He didn't just rule, he was adored by divine right in a land that specialized in ceremonial worship. And Nero loved ceremony. Roman sources already describe him as theatrical, indulgent, and deeply invested in his own image. Add Egyptian divinity to that mix, and you get a ruler who felt not just powerful, but cosmically justified. When a man who enjoys applause is told the gods demand it, restraint exits the room quietly. Unlike earlier pharaohs who were shaped by Egyptian tradition from birth, Nero dropped into the role fully formed, with Roman habits intact. The result was a collision of cultures, Roman excess wrapped in Egyptian sanctity. The rituals continued, the incense burned, and the emperor's ego expanded accordingly. What's especially telling is how differently Egypt remembered Nero compared to Rome. Roman writers loathed him. Egyptian records were neutral to positive. Why? Because Egypt had centuries of experience surviving rulers who behaved badly behind divine masks. Nero wasn't shocking there. He was familiar. He represents a strange turning point. The pharaohship without responsibility. Nero received worship without having to maintain the ancient balance Egyptian kings were expected to uphold. He didn't protect Ma'at. He didn't embody cosmic order. He just accepted the benefits. Nero's perversion wasn't uniquely Egyptian. It was imported. He shows us what happens when absolute reverence meets absolute ego, stripped of the cultural restraints that once kept divine kingship somewhat grounded. Egypt didn't change Nero. Nero simply took advantage of Egypt. And in that sense, he may be the most honest chapter in this story. Proof that when anyone is treated like a god long enough, they start acting like one. Badly. After 15 pharaohs, one pattern should feel impossible to ignore. Ancient Egypt didn't produce unusually perverted rulers. It produced unchecked ones. The behaviour wasn't random. It wasn't cultural accident. It was structural. Pharaohs weren't just kings. They were living gods. Their bodies were sacred. Their words were law. And their desires were framed as cosmic will. In that kind of system, restraint doesn't disappear overnight. It simply never develops. You don't learn boundaries when no one has the authority to set them. What looks like indulgence to us often looked like duty to them. Incest wasn't taboo. It was tradition. Excess wasn't greed. It was divine favour. Absolute control wasn't tyranny. It was stability. When the entire culture reinforces these ideas, behaviour that would be condemned elsewhere becomes normalised, even celebrated. And once something is normalised, it stops being questioned. Some pharaohs leaned into intimacy, some into luxury, some into domination, some into silence. Some did very little at all, trusting the system to run itself while they enjoyed the benefits. But all of them shared one thing: no meaningful consequences. Even the so-called bad pharaohs were rarely punished. At worst, their names were erased later, long after they were dead and comfortably beyond accountability. During their lives, they moved freely within a palace designed to protect privacy, obedience, and silence. That's the real discomfort here. Not the behaviour itself, but how easily it survived. Egypt endured because its institutions were strong enough to outlast individual excess. But those excesses left marks: weakened dynasties, fragile successions, declining authority, and a long tradition of pretending nothing was wrong as long as rituals continued. From Akhenaten's boundary-breaking affection to Ptolemaic sibling marriages, from indulgent courts to rulers who simply checked out, history shows us that power doesn't corrupt in one dramatic moment. It corrodes slowly, politely, and often with incense burning in the background. So when we call these pharaohs perverted, what we're really saying is this: they lived in a world where nothing pushed back. And history's quiet warning is simple. Whenever power becomes sacred, human behaviour stops being negotiable. Not because people become worse, but because no one is allowed to say no. And that, more than any scandal, is what turns rulers into legends, and systems into cautionary tales. Victoria was not raised to be queen. That is the great irony at the heart of her childhood. Born in 1819, she entered the world as a minor royal afterthought, fifth in line to the British throne, small, sickly, and very easy to overlook. No one at court looked at the infant princess and thought she would one day become the face of an empire stretching across the globe. That assumption, of course, did not age well. Her early years were defined by something known as the Kensington system, a rigid and suffocating method of upbringing, devised by her mother and her mother's ambitious advisor. Its purpose was simple and cruel: total dependence. Victoria was rarely allowed to be alone. She slept in her mother's bedroom, was constantly supervised, and had every hour of her day scheduled with near military precision. Even her toys were inspected, even her walks were timed. Privacy, as a concept, simply did not exist. This was not a childhood designed for joy. It was designed for control. The young princess was isolated from other children, discouraged from forming emotional attachments, and trained to obey without question. The message was subtle but constant. You are fragile, you need guidance, and you cannot survive on your own. For a girl who would later rule with iron consistency, this early helplessness cut deep. Yet something unexpected happened. Instead of breaking her, the system sharpened her. Victoria developed an intense inner life. She read obsessively, wrote constantly, and learned to observe people closely, since she had little power to influence them. She became stubborn, emotionally guarded, and fiercely aware of her own dignity. If she could not control her world, she would at least control herself. By the time she reached her teens, the line of succession had quietly collapsed around her. Uncles died. Heirs failed to appear. Suddenly, the overlooked child was the inevitable future monarch. The same people who once treated her as a pawn now bowed and smiled a little too eagerly. At 18, Victoria would inherit the crown. But long before that moment, she had already learned the most important lesson of her life. Power could be lonely, but dependence was unbearable. That belief would shape everything that followed. Victoria became queen in a quiet room, early in the morning, half awake and still wearing a nightgown. There was no dramatic trumpet blast, no crowded hall, no moment of theatrical destiny. Just two men standing at the foot of her bed, informing her that her uncle was dead, and that she was now the ruler of Britain. She was 18 years old, barely an adult by modern standards, and entirely unprepared for the scale of what had just landed on her shoulders. Yet her first instinct surprised everyone. She asked to be alone. For the first time in her life, she had a room to herself. No mother sleeping nearby, no advisor hovering, no schedule imposed by someone else's ambition. That single request was small, but symbolic. The girl raised to depend on others had decided that her reign would begin with independence. Victoria's early months as queen were marked by intense scrutiny. Many expected her to be weak, pliable, easily steered by politicians twice her age. Instead, she proved stubborn, emotional, and very much aware that she was queen by right, not by permission. She listened closely, but she decided for herself. This unsettled a political world accustomed to managing monarchs behind the scenes. Her closest relationship quickly formed with her Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, a worldly, charming figure who became her political tutor and emotional anchor. He guided her through paperwork, explained parliamentary manoeuvring, and offered reassurance when the weight of the crown pressed too hard. Critics whispered that she relied on him too much. They were not wrong. But after a childhood defined by control, Victoria had chosen her dependents carefully. The public watched her obsessively. Every gesture was analysed. Every expression became a statement. She was young, unmarried, and visibly human in a role designed for distance and ceremony. Crowds adored her vulnerability. They saw not an abstract monarch, but a girl trying to grow into power in real time. Still, the job was relentless. Boxes of documents arrived daily. Audiences never ended. Decisions carried consequences she could not fully see yet. Victoria worked hard, sometimes too hard, driven by a fear she never voiced, that any sign of weakness would invite someone else to take control again. Her reign had begun not with confidence, but with resolve. She would learn quickly, rule personally, and guard her authority fiercely. The crown had come to her suddenly, but she had no intention of letting it slip just as easily. Victoria did not fall in love quietly. When Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha entered her life, he did not simply become her husband, he became the centre of her emotional universe. She met him first as a teenager, but it was their reunion a few years later that changed everything. This time, she was queen, and protocol demanded that she be the one to propose. She did so eagerly, almost urgently, as if afraid the opportunity might vanish if she hesitated. Their marriage in 1840 was not merely romantic. It was political, personal, and deeply psychological. Victoria adored Albert with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She wrote of him constantly, praised him endlessly, and leaned on him for guidance in matters both public and private. For a woman raised under strict control, this devotion was not a contradiction. It was familiar. The difference was that this time, she had chosen it. Albert was intelligent, disciplined, and deeply serious about duty. He believed monarchy should be moral, efficient, and visibly respectable. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to shape the tone of Victoria's reign. He organised her schedule, reviewed state papers, and influenced policy discussions. Officially, he had no power. In practice, he had enormous influence. Critics noticed. Parliament muttered. Victoria, fiercely protective, dismissed them all. Their marriage was not always easy. Victoria resented pregnancy, despised childbirth, and struggled with the physical toll of having 9 children. Yet she clung to Albert emotionally, needing his approval, his presence, his steadying influence. He became her anchor, the one person who made the crown bearable. Together, they rebranded the monarchy. Gone was excess and scandal. In its place came domestic virtue, family life, and carefully curated respectability. Christmas trees, moral lectures, and idealized images of royal parenthood flowed outward from their household and into the wider culture. What Victoria and Albert lived privately became a public model for the nation. But beneath the surface, a quiet imbalance was forming. Albert's growing authority unsettled those who believed a foreign prince should not guide Britain's queen. Victoria, however, refused to see it. Love, for her, was loyalty, and loyalty demanded absolute trust. The monarchy had gained stability through marriage, but Victoria had also handed over a piece of her independence, convinced that love and control could coexist without consequence. Time would prove otherwise. By the middle of Victoria's reign, Britain was no longer merely a kingdom. It was an empire in constant motion, stretching across continents, oceans, and time zones. Steamships crossed seas with new efficiency. Railways carved through landscapes. Factories roared day and night. The world was accelerating, and Victoria sat at its symbolic centre, both elevated and strangely distant from the forces reshaping daily life. The Industrial Revolution transformed Britain with brutal speed. Cities swelled, wealth multiplied, and misery followed closely behind. While Victoria herself rarely witnessed the worst conditions of factory labour or urban poverty, she could not escape their political consequences. Reform bills, social unrest, and calls for expanded rights landed on her desk with relentless regularity. Her role was constitutional, not executive, but influence flowed through conversation, expression, and subtle pressure. Victoria believed deeply in hierarchy and order. She saw empire as a civilizing mission, not a moral contradiction. To her, Britain's expansion represented stability, discipline, and progress, even when it brought violence and exploitation. This worldview was not unusual for her time, but her position gave it immense symbolic power. The empire grew under her name, even when she personally played little role in its management. Publicly, she embodied continuity. Privately, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily. The crown demanded emotional restraint. The monarchy demanded visibility. The empire demanded certainty. Victoria responded by working relentlessly, reading state papers late into the night, and maintaining constant correspondence with ministers. She may not have ruled directly, but she refused to be irrelevant. Albert remained her partner in this world of accelerating change. He championed science, education, and technological progress, believing that monarchy must adapt or perish. The Great Exhibition of 1851, housed in the Crystal Palace, became the ultimate expression of their shared vision. It celebrated industry, invention, and British dominance under a glass cathedral of modernity. Victoria saw it as proof that their moral monarchy could thrive in an industrial age. Yet cracks were forming, political tensions intensified, class divisions widened, the empire's reach expanded faster than its moral justifications could sustain. Victoria sensed instability, even if she could not fully articulate it. She clung tighter to tradition, to family, and to the belief that duty itself could hold the world together. The crown had become heavier, not because of opposition, but because the world beneath it was changing too fast to control. Albert's death in 1861 shattered Victoria in a way no political crisis ever could. He was only 42, worn down by illness and exhaustion, and when he died, something inside the Queen collapsed with him. This was not a loss she could manage with duty or discipline. It was personal, total, and irreversible. Victoria did not simply mourn her husband. She retreated from life itself. Almost overnight, the public queen vanished. Curtains were drawn, public appearances ceased. Court life froze. Victoria dressed in black and would never wear another colour again. She preserved Albert's rooms exactly as he had left them, insisting that his clothes be laid out daily, his shaving water refreshed, as if death were merely a prolonged absence. Grief became ritual. Ritual became identity. For a nation accustomed to seeing its monarch as a symbol of strength and continuity, this withdrawal was unsettling. Critics accused her of neglecting her duties. Satirical cartoons portrayed her as a recluse, ruled by sorrow. Some even questioned whether the monarchy itself could survive a queen who refused to be seen. Victoria was aware of the criticism, but she did not care. The world, to her, had ended. Everything else felt secondary. In reality, she continued to rule from behind closed doors. Papers were read, decisions were made, ministers were consulted, but the emotional centre of her reign was gone. Albert had been her interpreter, her filter, her stabilizing force. Without him, she felt exposed and adrift, suddenly aware of how much of her confidence had rested on his presence. Grief reshaped her personality. She became more rigid, more suspicious, and more emotionally guarded than ever before. Where once she had balanced sentiment with engagement, she now leaned fully into withdrawal. Mourning was no longer a phase. It was a permanent state. Yet paradoxically, this private devastation reshaped public culture. Victoria's prolonged mourning transformed how society understood grief, respectability, and emotional restraint. Black clothing became a moral statement. Public displays of sorrow became acceptable, even expected. Her pain set the emotional tone for an entire age. The empire continued, politics continued, industry continued, but at the heart of it all stood a woman frozen in loss, ruling a world that kept moving without the one person who had made it bearable. By the late 1860s, Britain faced an uncomfortable contradiction. Its empire was expanding, its economy booming, and its global influence unmatched, yet its queen remained largely invisible. Victoria's prolonged mourning had stretched from months into years, and public patience was wearing thin. Newspapers grumbled, politicians worried. Republican sentiment, once marginal, began to surface more openly. A monarch who could not be seen, some argued, might as well not exist. Victoria felt these pressures keenly, even as she resisted them. She believed her grief was not weakness, but fidelity. To move on publicly would feel like betrayal. Yet she was also acutely aware that the monarchy depended on visibility and ritual. Slowly, reluctantly, she began to re-emerge, not as the young queen of 1837, nor as the devoted wife of 1840, but as something new, the widow queen. This new role carried its own authority. Victoria presented herself as a figure of endurance rather than vitality, moral gravity rather than charm. She spoke less, appeared sparingly, and allowed silence to do much of the work. When she did return to public ceremonies, she was met not with resentment, but with sympathy. Her grief, once criticized, had become familiar. In time, it even became reassuring. Behind the scenes, however, Victoria relied heavily on a small circle of trusted attendants. Most notable among them was John Brown, a Scottish servant whose closeness to the Queen sparked endless rumour. Brown was blunt, protective, and unafraid to treat Victoria like a human being rather than an institution. Their relationship scandalised courtiers and delighted cartoonists, but it served a vital function. He grounded her. After years of emotional isolation, Victoria needed someone who spoke plainly and expected nothing from her crown. Politically, her confidence returned unevenly. She resisted reforms she disliked, supported ministers selectively, and asserted her opinions with renewed sharpness. Experience had hardened her. Loss had stripped away sentimentality. What remained was resolve. Gradually, the public narrative shifted. Victoria was no longer a vanished monarch, but a symbol of perseverance. She had suffered, endured, and continued. In an age obsessed with progress and productivity, her visible mourning offered a different lesson: that grief could coexist with duty, and that survival itself was a form of strength. The Queen had not returned unchanged. She had been reshaped by absence, and the nation, whether it realised it or not, was beginning to follow her lead. As Victoria aged, the world around her grew louder, faster, and more restless. Nations industrialised, rival empires sharpened their ambitions, and Britain's dominance, while still vast, was no longer unquestioned. Yet paradoxically, this period of uncertainty elevated Victoria to new symbolic heights. She was no longer merely queen. She had become an era. In 1876, Parliament granted her a new title, Empress of India. The gesture was political, theatrical, and deeply revealing. India was the crown jewel of the empire, vast and complex, ruled from a distance through administrators and soldiers. Victoria never set foot there, yet her name carried immense authority. To supporters, the title affirmed Britain's global supremacy. To critics, it exposed the growing gap between imperial image and imperial reality. Victoria herself embraced it enthusiastically. It was recognition, not of her power, but of her permanence. By now, she had ruled longer than any British monarch before her. Prime ministers came and went. Governments rose and fell. She outlasted them all. Experience had given her confidence, and age had freed her from the need to please. She spoke her mind openly, often sharply, especially on matters of empire, monarchy, and moral order. Ministers learned to listen carefully, even when they disagreed. Public affection returned in force. Jubilees marked her reign as something almost mythic. Crowds gathered not to see a young queen, but to witness history itself, embodied in an elderly woman dressed in black. She represented stability in a century defined by change. In an age of uncertainty, endurance became its own form of authority. Yet beneath the celebrations lay unease. The empire was strained. Social reform movements grew louder. Class divisions widened. Victoria disapproved of many modern ideas, especially those involving expanded democracy or women's independence. Ironically, the woman who ruled the largest empire in history believed strongly in traditional gender roles. Power, in her view, was exceptional, not transferable. Still, her presence mattered. Simply by existing, by having ruled so long, she gave continuity to a rapidly transforming world. Victoria no longer shaped the age through action, but through example. She was living memory, living tradition, and living contradiction. The sun still did not set on her empire, but shadows were beginning to lengthen. By the final decades of her life, Victoria had become something almost abstract. To her subjects, she was less a person than a presence, a fixed point around which history revolved. Most Britons had never seen her up close, yet they spoke of her as if she were a familiar figure, woven into the fabric of daily life. Her image hung in schools, post offices, and homes. Her name defined an age. The woman herself, however, remained stubbornly human, emotional, and deeply private. Victoria never stopped writing. Her journals filled thousands of pages, chronicling not just events, but feelings, frustrations, and opinions she would never express publicly. In private, she was sharp-tongued, sentimental, occasionally petty, and fiercely loyal to those she loved. She disliked many politicians, distrusted change, and complained freely about the burdens of age. The public myth of serene authority masked a restless inner world that never truly settled. Her relationship with the public was paradoxical. She avoided crowds, disliked ceremony, and resented intrusion, yet understood that monarchy depended on visibility. When she appeared, even briefly, people responded with awe. Not because she dazzled them, but because she endured. In a century obsessed with progress, Victoria represented continuity. She was proof that something permanent still existed. Family remained central to her identity. Her children and grandchildren married into royal houses across Europe, earning her the nickname, the Grandmother of Europe. These alliances were meant to preserve peace through kinship, though history would later prove how fragile that hope was. Victoria followed family politics obsessively, offering advice, warnings, and emotional pressure in equal measure. Even as she aged, she remained deeply involved, unable to relinquish control. Physically, her health declined. She struggled with mobility, eyesight, and chronic pain. Yet she refused to abdicate or retreat entirely. The crown, once placed on her teenage head, had become inseparable from her sense of self. To give it up would mean surrendering the last structure holding her life together. By the end, Victoria was both everywhere and nowhere. She shaped morality, identity, and memory simply by existing. The empire spoke in her name. The age carried her imprint. But behind the myth remained a woman who had loved fiercely, lost deeply, and carried duty long after joy had faded. Queen Victoria died in 1901 at the age of 81, closing a chapter of British history so long that it felt almost timeless. For most of her subjects, she had always been there. Generations were born, lived, and died under her reign. Her passing was not just the death of a monarch. It was the end of a psychological era. Her final years were marked by increasing frailty, though her will remained stubbornly intact. Even as her body failed, she continued to read state papers, receive ministers, and comment sharply on world affairs. She refused to fade quietly. The crown, which had shaped her since adolescence, stayed with her until the end, not as an ornament, but as an obligation she never believed she had the right to abandon. The reaction to her death was immense. Across Britain and the Empire, mourning erupted on a scale rarely seen. Shops closed, bells tolled, black crape draped cities and colonies alike. For a nation accustomed to her presence, the silence felt unsettling. The empire that had grown beneath her name now faced a future without her stabilizing shadow. Victoria left behind a complex legacy. She was neither a political mastermind nor a passive figurehead. She influenced policy through persistence, shaped culture through example, and defined morality through personal conviction. Her private grief had reshaped public behaviour. Her devotion to family had redrawn Europe's royal map. Her endurance had become synonymous with authority. Yet she was also deeply contradictory. A powerful female ruler who opposed women's independence, a symbol of domestic virtue who ruled over imperial violence, a monarch who hated publicity, yet became the most recognisable figure of her century. These tensions were not flaws to be resolved, but realities to be acknowledged. With her death, the Victorian age ended, and the modern world rushed in. The 20th century would bring new technologies, new wars, and new ideas that her worldview could barely have imagined. But the structure she helped solidify, constitutional monarchy anchored in tradition, survived her. Victoria began life as an overlooked child. She ended it as the embodiment of an empire. And in between, she proved that power, when carried long enough, becomes history itself. Before the 19th century, mental illness in America was not something to be treated. It was something to be endured, concealed, or removed from sight. Those labelled insane were rarely seen as sick. They were seen as broken, dangerous, or morally failed. Families hid them when they could. When they could not, the options were grim. Jails, poorhouses, basements, barns. Madness existed, but it did not belong anywhere respectable. As the young nation expanded, this quiet system began to collapse. Cities grew crowded. Families became smaller and less able to absorb relatives who could not work or conform. Industrial life demanded productivity, punctuality, and restraint. Anyone who could not meet those expectations stood out sharply. The mad were no longer invisible. They wandered streets, disrupted workplaces, frightened neighbours. Society could no longer pretend they were rare exceptions. At the same time, a new idea was taking hold. That madness might not be a sin or curse, but a condition. Something that could be studied. Something that might even be cured. Physicians began to argue that insanity followed patterns, that it responded to environment, and that chaos worsened it. If disorder caused madness, then order, they believed, could restore sanity. This belief carried enormous consequences. The solution was not freedom or understanding. It was separation. Madness needed to be moved indoors, away from families, away from streets, away from daily life. Specialized institutions would remove the afflicted from society and place them under supervision, structure, and routine. Out of fear, reform was born. Early supporters spoke with genuine hope. They imagined peaceful buildings surrounded by gardens where patients would rest, reflect, and slowly recover. No chains, no punishment, calm voices, clean rooms. The asylum was presented as a refuge, a place where society could finally treat madness with compassion rather than cruelty. But this shift also marked a turning point. Once madness had a place, it could be sent there. Families no longer needed to cope. Communities no longer needed to tolerate difference. Behaviour that was inconvenient, disruptive, or simply misunderstood could now be labelled illness and removed behind institutional walls. The asylum did not begin as a nightmare. It began as a promise that reason, structure, and isolation could fix what society feared to understand. And once that promise took shape in brick and iron, it would be very difficult to undo. Madness had moved indoors, and it would stay there for generations. The first American asylums were built on optimism. Reformers believed that madness was not permanent, not monstrous, and not beyond help. What patients needed, they argued, was removal from chaos and immersion in order. This philosophy became known as moral treatment, and for a brief moment, it truly was revolutionary. Moral treatment rejected punishment. No whips, no chains, no dark cells, at least in theory. Instead, patients were to live in clean, orderly environments where routine replaced confusion, regular meals, Fresh air, light work, quiet reflection. Physicians believed that calm surroundings could gently retrain the disordered mind. If insanity had been caused by stress, trauma, or excess, then balance would restore reason. These early institutions were deliberately small. Doctors insisted that patients needed individual attention. Superintendents knew their residents by name. Nurses were expected to show patience and restraint. Many patients did improve, especially those suffering from depression, grief, or temporary breakdowns. Success stories spread quickly, and the asylum became a symbol of progress rather than fear. Architecture reflected this hope. Buildings were airy and symmetrical, often set in rural landscapes far from city noise. Nature itself was considered therapeutic. Patients walked paths, tended gardens, and participated in structured labour meant to rebuild discipline without cruelty. Madness, for the first time, was treated as something human, but this system rested on fragile assumptions. It required time, space, funding, and trained staff. It also depended on the belief that most mental illness was short-term and curable. That belief would soon be tested. As word spread, demand exploded. Families brought relatives who had been hidden for years. Courts sent people who were disruptive but not criminal. Local governments realized asylums were convenient places to send those who did not fit elsewhere. The patient population swelled rapidly, far beyond what moral treatment was designed to handle. Doctors began to compromise. Individual care gave way to efficiency. Calm routines became rigid schedules. The asylum, once imagined as a place of healing, was slowly turning into a place of management. The tragedy was not that moral treatment failed. It was that it worked just well enough to convince society it had solved the problem of madness. And with that confidence, America built faster, bigger, and with far less caution. Hope had opened the door. What came through next would change everything. Once America committed to asylums, it committed fully. By the mid-19th century, institutional care was no longer an experiment. It was policy. States competed to build larger, grander facilities, each promising modern science, humane treatment, and social order. Legislators approved budgets with confidence. The asylum was no longer just a medical solution, it was a civic one. This expansion was fueled by a powerful belief that insanity could be managed at scale. If one asylum helped dozens, then a larger one could help thousands. Standardization replaced intimacy, rules replaced relationships. Efficiency became the new virtue. Moral treatment, once based on individual care, was stretched thin to fit a system designed for mass containment. The architecture grew monumental. Massive stone buildings rose on hills outside cities, visible from miles away. Their size was intentional. They were meant to project authority, stability, and scientific confidence. Inside, long corridors replaced small wards. Patients were grouped, classified, and labelled. The asylum began to resemble a self-contained city, complete with farms, workshops, and cemeteries. Doctors gained enormous power. Superintendents controlled every aspect of daily life, from sleep to speech to silence. Admission standards widened. People were committed for depression, epilepsy, alcoholism, postpartum distress, or simply being inconvenient to family members. Women were especially vulnerable. Husbands could institutionalize wives with minimal evidence. Disobedience, grief, or exhaustion could be reframed as illness. Once admitted, leaving was difficult. Recovery was defined by compliance. Patients who followed rules were considered improving. Those who resisted were labelled incurable. The line between treatment and punishment blurred quietly, without announcement. Staff shortages became chronic. Budgets rarely matched promises. As populations grew, care declined. Overcrowding eroded the very calm these institutions were meant to provide. Noise replaced serenity. Restraints returned, justified as necessary for safety. What began as protection slid toward control. The asylum system did not collapse suddenly. It drifted. Each small compromise seemed reasonable. Each expansion felt necessary. Few noticed how far it had moved from its original ideals. America had built an asylum state, not out of malice, but out of certainty. And certainty, when left unchallenged, can be far more dangerous than cruelty. For those inside, the asylum was not an idea or a policy. It was daily life. Days were rigidly structured, not for comfort, but for control. Bells dictated when to wake, when to eat, when to work, when to sleep. Silence was encouraged. Obedience was rewarded. Any deviation from routine was noted, recorded, and often punished. Patients were stripped of identity almost immediately. Personal clothing was replaced with institutional garments. Hair was cut. Names were reduced to diagnoses. Records followed them more closely than people did. To the institution, patients were not individuals in distress. They were cases to be managed, behaviours to be corrected, risks to be contained. Work was central to asylum life. Men laboured on farms, in workshops, or maintaining buildings. Women cooked, cleaned, sewed, and did laundry. This labour was described as therapeutic, a way to instill discipline and purpose. In reality, it also kept costs down and institutions running. Refusal to work was treated as defiance, not exhaustion or despair. Privacy barely existed. Dormitories were crowded, bathrooms were shared, surveillance was constant, attendants watched, reported, restrained. Many were poorly trained and overworked. Compassion depended on individual temperament, not policy. Abuse was not universal, but it was common enough to become normalised. Complaints rarely travelled upward. Patients, after all, were officially unreliable. Medical treatment was crude and experimental. Ice baths to shock the system. Rotating chairs to induce dizziness. Bleeding, purging, enforced isolation. These methods were not acts of sadism in the eyes of doctors. They were attempts to impose order on minds believed to be disordered by excess energy or imbalance. Pain was framed as correction. Perhaps the most devastating aspect was uncertainty. Patients rarely knew why they were there or how long they would stay. Some recovered and left. Many did not. Others improved but remained institutionalized because no one came to retrieve them. Families moved on. Records grew thicker. Years passed quietly. For society outside the walls, the asylum solved a problem. Streets were calmer, homes were orderly, disruption had been removed. Inside, however, time slowed, identities faded, and hope became fragile. The asylum promised healing. What it delivered, more often than not, was disappearance. As the decades passed, the asylum's original purpose quietly shifted. What had been built to treat illness increasingly functioned to contain it. Recovery was no longer the central goal. Stability was. Order was. Keeping patients quiet, predictable, and out of sight became the unspoken priority. Care gave way to custody, not through cruelty alone, but through exhaustion and neglect. Overcrowding reached critical levels. Institutions designed for a few hundred now held thousands. Beds filled hallways. Patients slept inches apart. Noise never stopped. The calm atmosphere promised by moral treatment vanished entirely. Doctors could not possibly know their patients anymore. Decisions were made in bulk. Individual suffering blurred into background hum. With too many patients and too few staff, restraint became routine. Straitjackets, cuffs, and isolation rooms were justified as safety measures, though they often served convenience more than care. A patient who screamed too much, cried too long, or refused orders could be restrained for hours or days. Resistance itself became evidence of illness. Diagnosis grew broader and looser. People were institutionalized for grief, poverty, disability, addiction, or simply lacking family support. Immigrants, the elderly, and the poor were disproportionately confined. Asylums absorbed society's unwanted populations under the banner of medicine. Once inside, it was difficult to argue for release. Insanity was assumed to be permanent unless proven otherwise, and proof required obedience. Medical authorities shielded the system from scrutiny. Superintendents wrote reports praising progress. Inspectors announced reforms. Outsiders rarely saw the worst conditions, and when they did, they were assured it was temporary. Few questioned whether the system itself was the problem. Patients learned quickly that survival depended on compliance. Those who followed rules were labelled manageable. Those who questioned authority were deemed incurable. Treatment plans became indistinguishable from discipline. Silence was interpreted as improvement. Emotional withdrawal was praised as calm. The tragedy was not just suffering, but invisibility. Once committed, a person's voice carried no weight. Letters were censored, complaints dismissed. Abuse, when it occurred, was buried beneath diagnoses and paperwork. By the late 19th century, many asylums were no longer hospitals in any meaningful sense. They were warehouses for human distress, operating under the assumption that madness, once removed from view, had been handled. The promise of healing had not disappeared. It had simply been buried beneath the need to control. By the late 19th century, cracks in the asylum system were no longer easy to ignore. Whispers of neglect turned into reports. Reports turned into investigations. What reformers found behind institutional walls shocked even those who expected failure. Overcrowded wards, patients restrained for convenience, filth, hunger, and silence mistaken for order. The promise of moral treatment had curdled into routine suffering. Journalists, doctors, and activists began to push back. Among them were former patients, nurses, and reformers who had seen the system from the inside. They described conditions that bore little resemblance to healing. Some patients were locked away for decades with no reassessment. Others died anonymously, buried in institutional cemeteries marked only by numbers. Madness, once feared, was now forgotten. Public outrage followed exposure, but reform was slow and uneven. State governments promised change, funding, and oversight. New regulations were drafted, inspections increased, yet the core problem remained untouched. There were simply too many people and too few alternatives. Asylums had become the default solution for poverty, disability, and social disruption. Reforming them meant confronting deeper failures in social care, and few were willing to do that. Doctors resisted criticism fiercely. Many believed that outsiders could not understand the difficulty of managing large populations of severely ill patients. They argued that restraint was necessary, that overcrowding was unavoidable, and that without asylums, chaos would return to streets and homes. In their view, the system was flawed but indispensable. Some reforms did improve conditions temporarily. Windows were opened. Diets improved. Abuse was addressed, at least on paper. But without reducing populations, change could not last. Every improvement was swallowed by new admissions. The asylum was expected to fix what society refused to face. Meanwhile, a darker idea took hold. If madness could not be cured, perhaps it could be prevented. This thinking laid the groundwork for more extreme solutions, reframing mental illness not as suffering to be treated, but as a threat to be controlled at the source. Reformers had opened the doors just enough for the public to glimpse the truth. What they revealed was not a broken system in need of adjustment, but a system built on fear, convenience, and silence. And once that truth was visible, the asylum could never again pretend to be purely humane. As confidence in the asylum system weakened, a new authority stepped in to fill the gap: science. Or rather, a version of science stripped of humility. By the late 19th century, many doctors no longer believed madness could be cured through environment or care. Instead, they began to see it as inherited, fixed, and dangerous to the social body. If treatment had failed, prevention would have to do. This shift was subtle but devastating. Mental illness was reframed as biological defect. Patients were no longer just suffering individuals, they were evidence of degeneration. Families were studied, lineages scrutinized. Madness, poverty, disability, and criminality were increasingly bundled together under one ominous label: unfitness. Inside asylums, this thinking hardened attitudes. Long-term patients were written off as hopeless. Resources flowed toward classification rather than care. Doctors measured skulls, catalogued behaviours, and searched for physical markers that could justify permanent confinement. The language of compassion gave way to the language of risk. This was the era when eugenics took hold in American medicine. The belief that society could be improved by limiting the reproduction of the unfit spread rapidly among professionals and policymakers. Asylums became key sites for this ideology. Patients were sterilized, sometimes with consent extracted under pressure, often without any consent at all. These procedures were framed as medical necessity, a public good, a kindness to future generations. The cruelty of this approach lay in its calmness. There were no chains, no shouting, no visible violence, just paperwork, signatures, and surgical tools. Patients were told it was for their own benefit. Many did not fully understand what was being done to them. They were deemed incapable of understanding anyway. Science provided cover. Data replaced empathy. Charts replaced stories. Once a person was labelled defective, their suffering no longer demanded urgency. It became expected, even justified. The asylum was no longer failing to cure madness. It had redefined its mission entirely. What began as a refuge had become a laboratory, and in that space, stripped of public scrutiny and moral restraint, medicine crossed a line that would haunt the 20th century. Madness was no longer something to heal. It was something to eliminate. By the early 20th century, the asylum system was unravelling, but not in any clean or compassionate way. Its failures were undeniable. Overcrowding remained severe. Treatments inspired more fear than hope. Public trust eroded as stories of abuse, forced sterilisation, and lifelong confinement became harder to dismiss. Yet despite all this, the system persisted, not because it worked, but because nothing had replaced it. States began cutting costs. Funding declined. Staff shortages worsened. Buildings aged and decayed. Asylums that once symbolised progress now looked like ruins of misplaced confidence. Patients lived among peeling walls, broken windows, and institutional fatigue. Reform had stalled. Abolition felt impossible. The system limped forward out of inertia. Medical thinking began to shift again. New psychiatric theories emerged. Some doctors questioned mass institutionalization entirely. Others argued that mental illness required medical hospitals, not custodial warehouses. But these ideas moved slowly, tangled in bureaucracy and fear. Closing asylums meant answering an uncomfortable question. Where would everyone go? The answer, for decades, was nowhere. Patients remained institutionalized simply because they had always been there. Many had no homes to return to, no families willing to claim them, no skills for life outside. The asylum had not just confined them, it had erased their place in society. When closures finally began, they were abrupt and poorly planned. Patients were released with minimal support, handed small stipends or addresses scribbled on paper. Some found care. Many did not. Homelessness rose. Jails filled. The problem had not disappeared. It had shifted location. The end of the asylum era was not a triumph. It was an evacuation. Society acknowledged that mass confinement was wrong, but failed to build anything humane in its place. The walls came down, but the thinking behind them lingered. What remained was a population shaped by decades of neglect and a public uneasy about responsibility. Madness had once been hidden behind stone and iron. Now it returned to streets and institutions, unprepared to handle it. The asylum collapsed, not because its work was done, but because its contradictions could no longer be ignored. And yet, the people it confined were still waiting for something better to take its place. The American asylum system did not end with a revelation. It ended with exhaustion. There was no single moment of reckoning, no collective apology, no clear acknowledgement of the harm done. Buildings were closed, repurposed, or abandoned. Records were boxed away. Cemeteries remained, often unmarked, filled with people whose lives had been reduced to diagnoses and intake dates. What the asylums left behind was not just physical ruin, but a legacy of fear and misunderstanding. Mental illness remained something to manage rather than understand, to relocate rather than address. The language changed. The structures shifted. But the impulse to separate, to control, to hide discomfort did not disappear. It adapted. Modern psychiatry learned from the worst excesses of the asylum era, but it also inherited its blind spots. Treatment improved, but access did not. care moved into communities without providing communities the tools to support it. The result was familiar. Jails, shelters, and emergency rooms replaced asylums as default containment spaces. The walls were gone, but the logic remained. The people once confined rarely entered history as individuals. Their stories were fragmented, preserved in case notes rather than voices. They appear as symptoms, behaviours, outcomes, rarely as people with desires, memories, or relationships. The asylum erased identity so thoroughly that even its victims were denied narrative. Yet there is something to be learned in that erasure. The rise of American mental asylums reveals how easily good intentions can harden into systems of harm. How fear, when paired with certainty, produces institutions that silence rather than heal. How science, when detached from compassion, becomes justification rather than care. The asylums were built with hope. That matters. But so does what followed. They remind us that solutions rooted in exclusion will eventually collapse under their own weight. That suffering cannot be managed indefinitely by moving it out of sight. Madness was feared. It was hidden. It was misunderstood. And in the attempt to control it, society built places that reflected its deepest anxieties. The asylums are gone, but the question they raised remains unresolved. How do you care for what you are afraid to see? The Victorian era lived in a constant state of contradiction. It celebrated reason, progress, and scientific discovery, yet it was surrounded by uncertainty at every turn. Cities expanded faster than they could be understood. Machines replaced human labour. Diseases swept through crowded neighbourhoods without warning. Death was common, visible, and often sudden. In a world changing this quickly, people wanted answers, not just practical ones, but existential ones. Science appeared to offer control. New discoveries promised to explain nature, the body, and the mind with mechanical precision. Electricity could animate dead muscle. Chemistry could transform matter. Anatomy could reveal the hidden structure of life itself. For Victorians, science was not abstract theory. It was spectacle, authority, and hope wrapped together. Yet science also created fear. As traditional religious explanations weakened, people were left with questions that science could not fully answer. What was consciousness? Where did the soul reside? What happened after death? The more science illuminated the physical world, the darker these unanswered spaces became. Victorians did not abandon belief. They rearranged it. This is where obsession took hold. The era became fascinated with anything that promised certainty about the human condition. Measurement replaced mystery, but mystery crept back in wearing scientific language. Devices, diagrams, and demonstrations gave superstition a new vocabulary. What could not be proven was still eagerly tested. Public lectures filled halls. Demonstrations drew crowds. Museums displayed human remains alongside machines. Scientific authority was theatrical, performative, and deeply persuasive. To question it felt backward, even immoral. Progress demanded belief. At the same time, grief saturated daily life. Child mortality was high. Epidemics were frequent. Mourning rituals were elaborate and constant. Victorians desperately wanted reassurance that death was not an ending, but a transition. Science, paradoxically, became a way to approach the spiritual without surrendering rational respectability. This tension defined the age. Victorians stood with one foot planted in reason and the other hovering over superstition. They trusted measurement, yet longed for meaning. They dissected bodies, then gathered in darkened rooms to speak with the dead. Science was not replacing belief. It was reshaping it. The Victorian obsession with knowledge was not about progress alone. It was about comfort. And in that search for certainty, the line between discovery and delusion would blur again and again. Phrenology promised something Victorians desperately wanted: a simple explanation for human complexity. According to its practitioners, the mind was divided into distinct faculties, each responsible for a trait like kindness, aggression, intelligence, or morality. These traits, they claimed, physically shaped the skull. By examining bumps and depressions on a person's head, One could read their character as clearly as a map. The appeal was immediate. Phrenology was scientific enough to feel modern, yet intuitive enough to feel accessible. No advanced education required, just trained fingers, a diagram, and confidence. Phrenologists set up practices in cities and towns, offering readings to anyone curious about themselves or others. Parlours hosted skull examinations the way later generations would host personality tests. This was not fringe belief. Respectable Victorians embraced it enthusiastically. Employers used phrenology to evaluate workers. Parents consulted it to guide children's education. Courts flirted with the idea that criminal behaviour could be identified by head shape alone. Phrenology offered certainty in a chaotic world. If morality could be measured, then disorder could be managed. What made it powerful was its moral authority. Phrenology claimed to be objective. It replaced subjective judgment with supposedly neutral observation. In reality, it reinforced existing prejudices. Social class, race, and gender were mapped onto skulls in ways that conveniently confirmed Victorian hierarchies. Poverty became biological. Criminality became destiny. Yet even skeptics were drawn in. Phrenological charts looked precise. Measurements felt reassuring. The language was scientific, even if the foundations were not. To challenge phrenology was to challenge progress itself, and few wanted to appear backward. Public demonstrations turned the practice into entertainment. Lecturers held skulls on stage, pointing out regions of vice and virtue to fascinated audiences. Museums displayed collections of crania, labelled with professions and crimes. Science became spectacle, and spectacle became proof. Eventually, criticism grew louder. Medical professionals began to dismantle phrenology's claims. Evidence failed to support its neat conclusions. But belief lingered long after credibility faded. Phrenology had done its work. It had taught society to see personality as measurable, fixed, and physically determined. More importantly, it revealed something deeper. Victorians were not simply obsessed with skulls, they were obsessed with certainty. They wanted to believe that human behaviour followed rules, that chaos could be mapped, and that morality had physical boundaries. Phrenology would fall out of favour, but the desire it satisfied would resurface again and again, dressed in new language, carrying the same promise, that science could explain who we are and who we are allowed to become. Electricity felt alive to Victorians. It crackled, leapt, shocked, and illuminated. It moved invisibly through wires and bodies alike, suggesting a hidden force animating the world. At a time when the boundary between life and death felt frighteningly thin, electricity seemed to promise mastery over that boundary. Public demonstrations drew enormous crowds. Scientists and showmen sent electric currents through severed animal limbs, causing them to twitch and jerk as if reanimated. Audiences gasped as dead muscle responded to unseen power. The implication was unsettling and irresistible. If electricity could move flesh, perhaps it was connected to life itself. Medical experimentation followed quickly. Doctors applied electric shocks to treat paralysis, melancholy, hysteria, and impotence. Some patients reported improvement, many did not. But the treatments persisted because they looked scientific. Machines hummed, wires glowed, pain was reframed as progress. Electricity did not need to work consistently. It needed to feel modern. Writers and philosophers joined the obsession. Electricity became a metaphor for vitality, intellect, and moral force. It crept into everyday language. People spoke of nervous energy, electric personalities, and charged emotions. The body was reimagined as a system of currents rather than humours or spirits. This fascination blurred into fantasy. Some believed electricity could restore consciousness to the dead if applied quickly enough. Others imagined machines that could preserve life indefinitely. Experiments skirted ethical boundaries, often without consent. The dead and dying became raw material for inquiry, justified by the promise of discovery. The obsession reached popular culture through novels, lectures, and exhibitions. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein captured the era's anxiety perfectly. The fear that science might animate without understanding, create without responsibility. The monster was not just a creature, it was a warning, Yet Victorians did not turn away. They leaned in. Electricity symbolized hope in an age haunted by decay. It offered the illusion that death was a technical problem waiting to be solved. What made this obsession dangerous was not the technology itself, but the belief attached to it. Electricity became a substitute for certainty, a way to imagine life as mechanical, predictable, and ultimately controllable. In chasing that vision, Victorians revealed a deeper truth. Their science was not just about understanding the world. It was about escaping the fear that some mysteries might never yield to explanation. If science could not fully explain death, Victorians were willing to consult it. Spiritualism emerged not as a rejection of reason, but as its strange extension. Seances promised communication with the dead through methods that borrowed the language of experiment, controlled environments, observers, reproducible phenomena. The afterlife, Victorians hoped, could be tested. Darkened parlours filled with respectable families holding hands around tables. Mediums entered trances. Knocks answered questions. Objects moved. Voices whispered from unseen corners. To modern eyes, it looks like theatre. To Victorians, it felt methodical. Conditions were controlled, witnesses were present, conclusions were drawn. Spiritualism thrived because grief was everywhere. Infant mortality, epidemics, and industrial accidents left few families untouched. Traditional religion offered comfort, but not immediacy. Seances offered direct contact, a voice, a sign, a confirmation that the dead still existed somewhere reachable. What made spiritualism uniquely Victorian was its insistence on credibility. Mediums published findings, journals debated results. Some scientists attended seances seriously, convinced they were witnessing undiscovered natural forces. Others tried to expose fraud, often failing to convince believers. The desire to believe outweighed skepticism. Women played central roles as mediums, a rarity in male-dominated scientific culture. Their supposed sensitivity made them ideal conduits between worlds. Spiritualism offered women authority, income, and visibility denied elsewhere. That alone ensured its popularity endured. Technology reinforced belief. Telegraphy accustomed people to invisible communication across vast distances. If messages could travel through wires, why not through spirits? Photography, still poorly understood, captured ghostly blurs that were interpreted as proof of presence. Science had trained Victorians to trust what they could not see. Critics warned of deception. Exposés revealed hidden wires, ventriloquism, and sleight of hand. Yet exposure rarely killed belief. The emotional need spiritualism fulfilled was too deep. Even fraud became evidence, reframed as interference rather than falsehood. Seances revealed the Victorian mind at its most revealing. Faced with loss and uncertainty, people did not abandon reason. They repurposed it. They demanded that the supernatural behave scientifically. In doing so, Victorians blurred the boundary between inquiry and faith. The dead were no longer silent. They were experimental subjects, and belief, once dressed in scientific language, became remarkably difficult to let go. While some Victorians searched for the soul, others focused obsessively on the body. Anatomy promised certainty where spiritual science drifted. Flesh could be opened, organs could be named, death, at least biologically, could be mapped. Dissection became the most brutal and convincing form of knowledge the age possessed. Anatomy theatres drew crowds. Students, doctors, and curious onlookers gathered to watch bodies opened layer by layer. These were not quiet clinical spaces. They were public performances. The dead were displayed as educational tools, their identities stripped away in service of progress. To understand life, Victorians believed, one had to look directly at death. This obsession was fueled by scarcity. Legal cadavers were rare, supplied mostly from prisons and poorhouses. The bodies of the poor became raw material for science. Grave robbing flourished to meet demand. Nighttime resurrectionists dug up fresh corpses and sold them to medical schools. Families guarded graves. Iron cages were built over burial plots. Even in death, the body was not safe. When scandals broke, outrage followed. but reform lagged. The solution was not to question dissection, but to regulate supply. Laws expanded who could be used for anatomy, reinforcing a grim truth. Scientific progress often fed on those with the least power. The poor were dissected so the living could learn. Anatomy reshaped how Victorians saw themselves. The body became mechanical. Organs were components. Disease was malfunction. This framing advanced medicine dramatically, but it also encouraged detachment. Pain became data. Suffering became instructional. Public fascination grew alongside professional practice. Wax models displayed idealized organs and diseases. Museums showcased preserved remains. Medical knowledge entered popular culture, blurring the line between education and voyeurism. Curiosity became normalized, yet beneath the confidence lay unease. Dissection confronted Victorians with uncomfortable truths. The body, once opened, revealed no soul, no moral center, just tissue. For some, this strengthened belief in science. For others, it deepened spiritual anxiety. If the soul was not visible, where was it? Anatomy did not answer that question. It simply removed illusion. Victorians learned how the body worked, but not what it meant. And in that gap, between understanding structure and understanding purpose, obsession flourished. To know the body completely was to hope that nothing essential would be missing when the knife finished its work. As Victorians mapped skulls and dissected bodies, they grew increasingly obsessed with a more unsettling question. Could the mind itself be controlled? Mesmerism offered an answer that felt both scientific and uncanny. Originating from theories of animal magnetism, it proposed that invisible forces flowed through living beings, forces that could be manipulated to influence thought, sensation, and behavior. Public demonstrations were everywhere. Mesmerists placed subjects into trances with gestures, stares, or passes of the hands. Volunteers stiffened, hallucinated, obeyed commands, or claimed freedom from pain. Audiences watched in rapt attention as individuals appeared to surrender their will entirely. The implications were thrilling and terrifying. If the mind could be guided so easily, how much control did anyone truly possess? Doctors experimented eagerly. Mesmerism was applied to treat anxiety, hysteria, addiction, and chronic pain. Some patients reported real relief, especially during surgeries performed under hypnotic states before anesthesia became common. To supporters, this was proof that the mind held untapped power. To critics, it was evidence of suggestibility and deception. What mesmerism revealed was less about magnetic forces and more about vulnerability. Victorians were discovering that belief itself could alter perception, pain could be muted, memory could shift, identity could blur. This realization unsettled a society built on self-control and moral discipline. If the mind could be overridden, then personal responsibility became uncertain. Mesmerism also raised ethical questions few wanted to confront. Subjects were often poor, female, or socially marginalized. Consent was assumed, not examined. A person in trance was treated as an object of study rather than a participant. Control was justified as cure. Over time, mesmerism evolved into hypnotism, shedding its mystical language while retaining its core fascination. The invisible force was replaced with psychological explanation, but the power dynamic remained. The practitioner commanded. The subject complied. Science once again offered authority over the unseen. Victorians did not abandon mesmerism because it failed. They abandoned it because it worked too well at revealing uncomfortable truths. It showed that reason was fragile, that consciousness could be bent, and that the line between influence and domination was thin. In trying to master the mind, Victorians confronted the possibility that the self was not as stable as they believed. And that realization lingered long after the trances ended. Victorians were not content to study ideas in the abstract. They wanted physical proof, evidence that could be seen, labelled, and stored. This impulse gave rise to one of the era's most unsettling habits, the collection of human abnormality. Bodies, bones, organs, and preserved remains-filled cabinets, museums, and private collections, each specimen presented as a lesson in deviation. Medical museums became temples of classification. Jars lined with shelves held malformed fetuses, diseased organs, and unusual growths suspended in cloudy liquid. These were not hidden away from public view. Many were displayed openly, toured by students and curious visitors alike. The abnormal body was framed as educational, stripped of identity and reduced to function. Collectors believed they were cataloguing nature's mistakes. Deformity was treated as data. Difference became pathology. The human body was no longer simply human, it was evidence. Doctors compared specimens, searching for patterns that could explain illness, behaviour, or moral failure. Once again, certainty was pursued through categorization. This obsession extended beyond medicine. Travelling exhibitions displayed people with physical differences as scientific curiosities. Audiences were told they were witnessing rare biological phenomena, not entertainment. The language of science sanitized voyeurism. To stare was no longer rude. It was educational. Race, disability, and disease were woven into these displays in disturbing ways. Colonized peoples were measured, photographed, and exhibited as evolutionary specimens. Skulls were ranked. Bodies were arranged into hierarchies that conveniently reinforced imperial belief. Science, once again, offered justification for existing power structures. Even death did not grant privacy. Autopsies multiplied. Bodies of the poor were claimed without consent. Remains were kept indefinitely, long after their scientific value faded. The individual vanished beneath the label. What drove this obsession was fear disguised as curiosity. Victorians were terrified of disorder, of bodies that did not behave as expected, of lives that resisted classification. By collecting the abnormal, they believed they were containing it. Knowledge became a form of control, yet these collections revealed more about the collectors than the collected. They exposed a worldview that equated difference with danger and understanding with ownership. To possess the body was to possess the truth. In trying to explain humanity through fragments, Victorians fractured it instead, and the cost of that fragmentation would echo long after the jars were sealed and the cabinets closed. By the late Victorian period, the line between inquiry and ideology had grown dangerously thin. Scientific language carried immense authority, and once an idea adopted its tone, it gained protection from doubt. Hypotheses hardened into truths. Speculation passed as fact. Science was no longer just a method, it was a worldview. Victorians trusted science not only to explain nature, but to define morality, intelligence, and worth. Measurements, charts, and classifications promised objectivity, yet they quietly absorbed cultural bias. Race, class, gender, and ability were reframed as biological destiny. Inequality was no longer a social failure. It was nature, measured and confirmed. This was the era when scientific obsession stopped asking questions and started giving answers it could not support. The language of proof was used to silence debate. If something was scientific, opposing it seemed irrational, even dangerous. Belief no longer required faith. It required citation. Institutions reinforced this authority. Universities, museums, hospitals, and journals circulated ideas with shared assumptions. Each cited the other. Circular certainty replaced skepticism. Once embedded, flawed ideas became self-sustaining. To challenge them meant challenging progress itself. The public followed eagerly. Victorians were taught to admire expertise, even when it contradicted lived experience. A diagnosis outweighed testimony. A chart outweighed suffering. The individual disappeared beneath the category. Science became a filter through which reality was interpreted, not questioned. Yet anxiety lingered beneath the confidence. The more Victorians tried to explain everything, the more they sensed something essential slipping away. Consciousness, meaning, and morality resisted reduction. Spiritual movements persisted not because science failed, but because it succeeded at removing mystery without replacing comfort. In response, science itself took on religious qualities. Experts replaced priests, lectures replaced sermons, laboratories replaced sanctuaries. The promise was salvation through understanding. The price was doubt. This was the paradox at the heart of Victorian obsession. They wanted certainty, but certainty demanded belief. And belief, once granted scientific authority, became remarkably difficult to dislodge. Science had not defeated superstition. It had absorbed it. And in doing so, Victorians created a legacy that still lingers today. A faith in knowledge so strong that it can forget to question itself. Victorian scientific obsession was not a failure of intelligence. It was a reflection of fear of death, disorder, and meaninglessness in a world changing too fast to feel stable. Science offered light, but it also cast long shadows. Victorians stood between those extremes, convinced that if they leaned hard enough toward reason, the darkness would retreat. What they discovered instead was ambiguity. Every answer raised new questions. Every discovery exposed new uncertainty. The skull did not reveal the soul. Electricity did not explain consciousness. Dissection mapped the body, but left meaning untouched. Science illuminated mechanisms, not purpose. In response, Victorians did what humans often do when certainty slips away. They filled the gaps, sometimes with hope, sometimes with superstition dressed as data, sometimes with systems that promised order at the cost of compassion. Their obsessions were not random. They followed emotional need. The tragedy was not curiosity itself. Curiosity built modern medicine, technology, and understanding. The tragedy was certainty without humility. When Victorians believed they had found final answers, they stopped listening. Measurement replaced empathy. Classification replaced story. Knowledge became authority rather than inquiry, yet their contradictions are also what make the era so revealing. Victorians were not foolish, they were human. They believed in progress while fearing its consequences. They trusted science while longing for spiritual reassurance. They dissected bodies and spoke to ghosts, not because they were confused, but because neither alone was enough. Their legacy is still with us. Modern science carries Victorian fingerprints, the desire to measure the unmeasurable, the temptation to turn probability into destiny, the belief that explanation equals understanding. Victorian scientific obsession teaches a quiet lesson. Knowledge expands fastest when paired with doubt. Progress becomes dangerous when it forgets its limits. The age reminds us that standing between reason and superstition is not a flaw. It is a human condition. Victorians did not choose between light and shadow. They lived in both, and in doing so, they left behind a cautionary inheritance, that the pursuit of truth must always be accompanied by the willingness to admit what we do not know. Because the moment certainty feels complete is often the moment understanding begins to fail.